All right, let's flip over and let's talk about our own experience. So how we did this here at Metadata. So it was one of the first things that you worked on, from what I remember. And so let's talk about. So here's the context. I had just like 5 months earlier did a new website. I think 4 months, 3 months, something like that. I don't even remember when I launched it. But so my context was. I'm like, oh yeah, I just launched a new website. It's got some new words on it, some new headlines, some new writing, so new design, and it was a fucking bear to go through. I was the only marketer here and trying to like wrangle cats to do work for me for free. So anyway, so context is I'm here and I'm like, oh, hey Mark, we got a brand new website. Like we're running, we're all good. And then you come in and tell me how you got to the point where you're like, maybe walk me through it from your positioning and messaging perspective. Well, first of all, you started as a customer, so you were seeing some of the marketing. Yep. And then you come in and tell me how you got to the point where you're like, oh shit, we gotta get on this pretty fast.
Yeah, and I'm gonna give away something that we are gonna start to kick off soon, which we're really excited about. But I call them holy shit moments. And I had them multiple times when I was being sold metadata at my last company with Logan when he was demoing me. And there are these times where you're just like, holy shit, like this can do that. And the reality was, even with the new, or at the time, the new website copy, what was on there wasn't wrong. It wasn't inaccurate. It was just, it wasn't really facilitating these like holy shit moments unless somebody talked to the sales team. So I wanted to do was take all the magic that was happening on these sales calls and then try to facilitate those moments earlier on in the process so that people understand what we do. Now, I think what we struggled with at first was the language that we were using, and really website copy at the end of the day was all internally focused. It was about us. It was about what we did, what impressive, engineering we had. And it's not that none of that is impressive, but when it's framed in a way that it's talking only about you and your company and not the audience at the end of the day, that's when you know that you need to flip it on its head and just use the language that they're using, talk to them, make sure that what you're talking about is what they are interested in and what they would get excited about, not what you get excited about.
That to me was like, my mind was blown because it seems so basic, right? I didn't realize I wrote about, like, I didn't even know I was writing in that way. You know what I mean? Like, probably because I'm an only child. Just kidding. It was all about me, But the reality is, I'd never heard that before because in my marketing ops roles, nobody cares how I write, ever. You know what I mean? So I'd never, ever just learned that or, like, realized it. But it's so clear, you know what I mean, when you make that shift that, oh my God, like, of course, you know what I mean? Like, this is so much better for the prospect, you know what I mean? Putting it into their, not terms, but you know what I mean? Like,
No. I mean, it is terms at the end of the day because you have to make sure that you're using language that they are using, and you can want to push messages out at the end of the day. And we did that previously, but it was using words that our audience did not use in everyday language. So if that's not happening, then you're already making it that much more difficult for you to, compel them to take some sort of action.
Yeah, and the reality was too, before Mark started, I had maybe listened to a small handful of calls. You know what I mean? I don't know why. It's probably time. I probably felt like I didn't have enough time, which was actually wrong. I mean, I should have been listening to those as a priority, just didn't really realize it. So I didn't have the luxury, really, like you did, of hearing like how off it was. And I think that was also probably, you were talking about that earlier, like the oh shit moments, but also probably you heard the confusion and the people talking, and we only had like probably three or four sales reps then. And they were probably still pretty tight with what they said, but maybe answer that. How off were they actually back in those early days? Were they all four of them still like pretty off, or were they pretty on back in the early one?
Well, and I love all of them, but to be fair, they weren't really off because we never really had anything defined. So
That's actually a perfect answer. So yeah, they were fending for themselves,
yeah,
really,
yeah.
right? Yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
yeah,
They were kind of
yeah.
coming up with it on their own. Yeah, that's right. That's actually, yes, right, right.
And I think what you're trying to do, and it was more manageable then because we had such a small sales team, and our sales team is significantly larger. Like, you can't just have every one of those reps fend for themselves and, figure out, what should I be saying or what's going to land. So that is a future episode that we will have probably 2-3 months from now, as we're working on rolling some of the more recent stuff out with our sales team. But I think what I did was I would listen to each of their calls, and also I would have separate interviews with longtime customers, new customers, late stage prospects, new prospects, and then even other B2B marketers in my network that really had no relationship with metadata. And I would just start to pick their brain on, hey, check out our website right now, whether you're familiar with metadata or not. Tell me what is landing, and more importantly, what's not landing. And then for those that have experience with metadata, how would you go describe metadata to somebody in your network? How would you go describe metadata to your friends? And like, you go in and you try to ask a few pointed questions, and you do a lot of listening, and you try not to interrupt. And we were blown away with some of the stuff that we heard. So yeah, it's very qualitative, and I think we didn't have endless resources. One of our advisors had said I think they worked on like a 150-page deck with all of this stuff that cost, I think it was well into the 5 figures, maybe close to 6 figures. We didn't have that, so like we had to get scrappy with it, and it's possible.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so you realized we needed to change, and you also wanted to do a new website. I think I don't remember if both of those things were at the same time. Obviously, they didn't get worked on at the same time, but like if you knew, yes, we need this, and then that's going to ultimately has to result in a new website. But talk through a little bit of your process. So you got to the point where you're like, okay, I know we need to change this. How did you go about doing it? You kind of sprinkled some of the things you've done, but like, what was the actual process?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, I actually would have made the wrong first step if you said, all right, here's budget for it. And the first step would have been starting with the website. So do not start with the website, because in order to write really legit copy, you need to have messaging in place. And in order to have messaging in place, then you need to have that positioning in place. So what I did was I met with probably close to 20-ish or so marketers and did these little interviews. And I got input from our sales team on what they think our positioning and messaging should be. I didn't have anything perfectly, formatted, but I was working on that in parallel with meeting with all of these different people. And what I would start to do is, once the positioning and messaging was getting, more solid, I would tease it out with the people that I was interviewing. And I was saying, be really honest with me right now. You know a lot about metadata. You might be using metadata right now. Is this how you look at metadata? Is this how you set the context for metadata? And getting real-time feedback from those people. And what I tried to not do was constantly make edits based on what a single person was saying, because it would have been so easy just to get caught in the edit hamster wheel, like we kind of have been with this narrative that we'll talk about here in a bit. But when you start to hear themes that keep coming up from 2, 3, 4, 5 interviews, then you know that you're onto something. So that was kind of the big start to all of this. I think the other mistake was not getting Gil involved sooner and not getting leadership involved sooner. If I were to do this over again, I would have got them involved much earlier in the process, because it appeared as if, hey, this is what Mark thinks our positioning and messaging should be, not this is what the market, thinks of metadata and how they position metadata and how they describe metadata.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. So then so you got that work done, and then how does it make it to the website? So you got the messaging, the positioning messaging work done. Is it a big stretch then, or does that make it a lot easier, I imagine?
I think if you put in the time for the positioning and the messaging, there really isn't that big of a leap from messaging to copy. Assuming that you're a good writer, which most product marketers are, not all product marketers, but it's not that drastic for me. I think the biggest leap is from positioning to messaging and knowing, what are the actual value statements that you want to focus on. Like, how do you truly make their lives easier? Once you have a really solid understanding of that, it's fairly easy. You have to be in the right creative mindset to turn it into copy, but it's not that big of a leap.
Cool. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit. So obviously, when you come up with it the first time, it's probably not going to be what lasts forever.
Absolutely not.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe some companies have been able to get away with that. I have no idea. Maybe some B2C brands, I have no idea. But I can't imagine a world where like, oh yeah, we're good. And for the next 10 years, like this is exactly how we're going to talk about the product. So we're kind of in the middle of something right now with our new strategic narrative. And, well, first of all, strategic narrative, how we talk about ourselves, our kind of founding story, our reason for being kind of story, and how we're going to help our ICP, for the lack of a better term. How do we go about changing it? So, especially in a big change like a strategic narrative, which for us is, a lot of the same of what we've been doing, but we're now branching off and we're going to do a lot more, and it's going to go outside of like the original area that we were really kind of building a solution for. So how do we go about the change? And what have we done this time?
Yeah, so this is probably another multi-part episode, but I think to a point that we were talking about earlier, you can have your positioning and messaging copied by your competitors, and it happens all the time. And I'm not going to name any competitors, but we launched our messaging, and then magically you start to see similar concepts appear on their site. So I think at that point we realized that, hey, we still need a way to stand out, and the best way to do that is around the company story being the narrative. So thankfully, with Gil working with Dave Gerhardt, he had realized how important that story is for the company, because the story is really the strategy at the end of the day. And depending on which employee you talk to, you shouldn't hear a different story about metadata. So for us, we had never worked on a narrative before. It's something that I had always wanted to do, but never had the opportunity, to work on. And for us, it's really an internal document or deck, if you will. And that story then becomes how you talk about metadata in your sales deck, how you talk about metadata in your investor deck. And it all should feel like you're hearing a different slice of the same story, but not a completely different company when you see one deck versus the other.